How's it going, everyone? It's Chow here, and today we are going to talk a little bit about tissues, or more specifically types of tissues. So let's get started. Okay, so in the most basic of biological organization schemes, we have the cell. So the cell, well, maybe the atom if you want to go all the way back there. But for simplicity's sake, we start off with cells. Cells are going to be making tissues. The tissues, of course, then can form organs. Organs are structured into organ systems, which eventually can be structured into an organism. But we're focusing on tissues in this particular discussion. So there are four main types of tissue. We have connective tissue, epithelial tissue, neural tissue, and muscle tissue. So connective tissues are ones that are basically going to be cells in the extracellular matrix. So connective tissue right there. We have epithelial tissue, which are mostly sheets of cells that allow for the creation of boundaries between the body. As we know, cavities, boundaries, those are fairly important. And then we also have neural tissues, which allows for information processing. So we're talking about neurons again. And then finally, we have muscle tissue, which there are three different types. And muscle tissues are very important because not just with contraction, they are also one of the most common types of effectors within our body. So connective tissues, which are cells in the extracellular matrix, epithelial tissues, which basically create boundaries, neural tissues allow for information processing, and muscle tissues, which are your effectors, or most common types of effectors. So let's start off with connective tissue. Well, the cells are going to be dispersed in terms of connective tissues they're going to be dispersed in the secreted extracellular matrix, so the extracellular matrix. They can be made of generally two types of structural proteins. So we have collagen, which is relatively resistant to stretching, so it supports skin and bone muscle connections, as well as elastin. So elastin is very elastic, as its name suggests, and it can be stretched. And elastin is often found in tissues that require some kind of stretching or malleability, such as the lungs. Now, in terms of connective tissues, they can actually be four different types. So we have cartilage, which is flexible and provides support. That's pretty straightforward. We have bone, which is actually another type of connective tissue, and it's generally hard due to calcium phosphate, and it allows, obviously, for structural roles and support roles. We have adipose tissue, which is going to be filled mostly with adipocytes, and that allows for storage of fats, so storage of lipids. And then finally, we have blood, which actually is also another connective tissue, and it is made of blood cells in a specific type of liquid extracellular matrix called plasma. So that's connective tissues in a nutshell. So moving on to epithelial tissues, these are sheets of tissues, again, that allows for formation of boundaries, especially between the body and external environment. It can also divide the body into different compartments. And the epithelial cells, which make these epithelial tissues, have many different structures based on function. So three different possible functions of epithelial cells include moving substances across epithelial tissues. So, just moving those moving those substances across those tissues. A second function of an epithelial cell is the secretion of certain types of enzymes. So that's pretty important. And finally, we have sensory perception. So there are a couple of things that epithelial cells can do, obviously more than these, but these are three major functions that are often discussed, at least at a basic level, in intro courses. So epithelial tissues, pretty cool. Next, we'll briefly mention our neural or nervous tissues. So we're talking about information processing again, and oftentimes we are discussing things such as neurons, which are obviously very critical for the central and peripheral nervous system. So we have our friend the neuron over here. And then, of course, there are different types of neurons. So we have sensory neurons, and then we have motor neurons, and then we also have interneurons that kind of innervate between sensory and motor neurons. And obviously, when we discuss neural or nervous tissues and neurons, we're going to be talking about signaling, often in the form of action potentials, as well as words such as depolarization, repolarization, and all that jazz. Now, obviously, what's very important about nervous tissues is that in terms of their function, they need help from things like ions and ion gradients. So we're talking about, again, depolarization and those nerve cell signaling in that other video that we did a while back. So something just to keep in mind. So that's a brief overview of nervous tissues. Last but not least, we have muscle tissues. So in terms of muscle tissue, there are 3 types. We have skeletal muscle tissue, which is responsible for body movement, often with voluntary body movement, such as walking, as well as semi-voluntary, I guess, with shivering, as well as if we're talking about intercostal muscles in the body, with breathing. We also have cardiac muscle, which is another type over here. And cardiac muscle is responsible for heart contraction. So contraction is pretty important. It allows us to live, and it also helps control heartbeat and obviously blood flow, so circulation. And finally, we have smooth muscle, which is generally found in internal organs. And these smooth muscles, through often involuntary contractions in the gut and blood vessels, allows, again, for a level of circulation as well as for peristalsis and movement of food for processes such as digestion. So there you go, some brief overview of muscle tissues as well as other types of tissues within our body. I hope you found this useful. Best of luck studying. See you in the next video.